Conclusion. I do not regard these statements as in any way a final proof of my views, but simply as a conclusion from empirical premises which I would like to submit to the consideration of my reader. From the material before us, I can derive no other hypothesis that would adequately explain the facts, including the ESP experiments. I am only too conscious that synchronicity is a highly abstract and irrepresentable quantity. It ascribes to the moving body a certain psychoid property which, like space, time, and causality, forms a criterion of its behavior. We must completely give up the idea of the psyches being somehow connected with the brain, and remember instead the meaningful or intelligent behavior of the lower organisms which are without a brain. Here we find ourselves much closer to the formal factor which, as I have said, has nothing to do with brain activity. If that is so, then we must ask ourselves whether the relation of soul and body can be considered from this angle. That is to say, whether the coordination of psychic and physical processes in a living organism can be understood as a synchronistic phenomenon rather than as a causal relation. Both Goelinks and Leibniz regarded the coordination of the psychic and the physical as an act of God, of some principle standing outside empirical nature. The assumption of a causal relation between psyche and physis leads, on the other hand, to conclusions which it is difficult to square with experience. Either there are physical processes which cause psychic happenings, or there is a pre-existent psyche which organizes matter. In the first case, it is hard to see how chemical processes can ever produce psychic processes, and in the second case, one wonders how an immaterial psyche could ever set matter in motion. It is not necessary to think of Leibniz's pre-established harmony or anything of that kind, which would have to be absolute and would manifest itself in a universal correspondence and sympathy, rather like the meaningful coincidence of time points lying on the same degree of latitude in Schopenhauer. The synchronicity principle possesses properties that may help to clear up the body-soul problem. Above all, it is the fact of causeless order, or rather, of meaningful orderedness, that may throw light on psychophysical parallelism. The absolute knowledge, which is characteristic of synchronistic phenomena, a knowledge not mediated by the sense organs, supports the hypothesis of a self-subsistent meaning, or even expresses its existence. Such a form of existence can only be transcendental, since, as the knowledge of future or spatially distant events shows, it is contained in a psychically relative space and time, that is to say, in an irrepresentable space-time continuum. It may be worth our while to examine more closely, from this point of view, certain experiences which seem to indicate the existence of psychic processes in what are commonly held to be unconscious states. Here I am thinking chiefly of the remarkable observations made during deep syncopes resulting from acute brain injuries. Contrary to all expectations, a severe head injury is not always followed by a corresponding loss of consciousness. To the observer, the wounded man seems apathetic, in a trance, and not conscious of anything. Subjectively, however, consciousness is by no means extinguished. Sensory communication with the outside world is in a large measure restricted, but is not always completely cut off, although the noise of battle, for instance, may suddenly give way to a solemn silence. In this state, there is sometimes a very distinct and impressive sensation or hallucination of levitation, the wounded man seeming to rise into the air in the same position he was in at the moment he was wounded. If he was wounded standing up, he rises in a standing position. If lying down, he rises in a lying position. If sitting, he rises in a sitting position. Occasionally, his surroundings seem to rise with him. For instance, the whole bunker in which he finds himself at the moment. The height of the levitation may be anything from 18 inches to several yards. All feeling of weight is lost. In a few cases, the wounded think they are making swimming movements with their arms. If there is any perception of their surroundings at all, it seems to be mostly imaginary, i.e., composed of memory images. During levitation, the mood is predominantly euphoric. A buoyant, solemn, heavenly, serene, relaxed, blissful, expectant, exciting are the words used to describe it. There are various kinds of ascension experiences. Jantz and Beringer rightly point out that the wounded can be roused from their syncope by remarkably small stimuli, for instance, if they are addressed by name or touched, whereas the most terrific bombardment has no effect. Much the same thing can be observed in deep comas resulting from other causes. I would like to give an example from my own medical experience. A woman patient, whose reliability and truthfulness I have no reason to doubt, told me that her first birth was very difficult. After 30 hours of fruitless labor, the doctor considered that a forceps delivery was indicated. This was carried out under light narcosis. She was badly torn and suffered great loss of blood. When the doctor, her mother and her husband had gone, and everything was cleared up, the nurse wanted to eat, and the patient saw her turn round at the door and ask, "Do you want anything before I go to supper?" She tried to answer but couldn't. She had the feeling that she was sinking through the bed into a bottomless void. She saw the nurse hurry to the bedside and seize her hand in order to take her pulse. From the way she moved her fingers to and fro, the patient thought it must be almost imperceptible. Yet she herself felt quite all right and was slightly amused at the nurse's alarm. She was not in the least frightened. That was the last she could remember for a long time. The next thing she was aware of was that, without feeling her body and its position, she was looking down from a point in the ceiling and could see everything going on in the room below her. She saw herself lying in the bed, deadly pale, with closed eyes. Beside her stood the nurse. The doctor paced up and down the room excitedly, and it seemed to her that he had lost his head and didn't know what to do. Her relatives crowded to the door. Her mother and her husband came in and looked at her with frightened faces. She told herself it was too stupid of them to think she was going to die, for she would certainly come round again. All this time she knew that behind her was a glorious, park-like landscape, shining in the brightest colors, and in particular, an emerald green meadow with short grass, which sloped gently upwards beyond a wrought iron gate leading into the park. It was spring, and little gay flowers such as she had never seen before were scattered about in the grass. The whole domain sparkled in the sunlight, and all the colors were of an indescribable splendor. The sloping meadow was flanked on both sides by dark green trees. It gave her the impression of a clearing in the forest, never yet trodden by the foot of man. I knew that this was the entrance to another world, and that if I turned round to gaze at the picture directly, I should feel tempted to go in at the gate and thus step out of life. She did not actually see this landscape, as her back was turned to it, but she knew it was there. She felt there was nothing to stop her from entering in through the gate. She only knew that she would turn back to her body and would not die. That was why she found the agitation of the doctor and the distress of her relatives stupid and out of place. The next thing that happened was that she awoke from her coma and saw the nurse bending over her in bed. She was told that she had been unconscious for about half an hour. The next day, some 15 hours later, when she felt a little stronger, she made a remark to the nurse about the incompetent and hysterical behavior of the doctor during her coma. The nurse energetically denied this criticism in the belief that the patient had been completely unconscious at the time and could therefore have known nothing of the scene. Only when she described in full detail what had happened during the coma was the nurse obliged to admit that the patient had perceived the events exactly as they happened in reality. One might conjecture that this was simply a psychogenic twilight state in which a split-off part of consciousness still continued to function. The patient, however, had never been hysterical and had suffered a genuine heart collapse followed by syncope due to cerebral anemia, as all the outward and evidently alarming symptoms indicated. She really was in a coma and ought to have had a complete psychic blackout and been altogether incapable of clear observation and sound judgment. The remarkable thing was that it was not an immediate perception of the situation through indirect or unconscious observation, but she saw the whole situation from above, as though her eyes were in the ceiling, as she put it. Indeed, it is not easy to explain how such unusually intense psychic processes can take place and be remembered in a state of severe collapse, and how the patient could observe actual events in concrete detail with closed eyes. One would expect such obvious cerebral anemia to militate against or prevent the occurrence of highly complex psychic processes of that kind. Sir Auckland Geddes presented a very similar case before the Royal Society of Medicine on February 26, 1927, though here the ESP went very much further. During a state of collapse, the patient noted the splitting off of an integral consciousness from his bodily consciousness, the latter gradually resolving itself into its organ components. The other consciousness possessed verifiable ESP. These experiences seem to show that in swoon states, where by all human standards there is every guarantee that conscious activity and sense perception are suspended, consciousness, reproducible ideas, acts of judgment and perceptions can still continue to exist. The accompanying feeling of levitation, alteration of the angle of vision, and extinction of hearing and of coanesthetic perceptions indicate a shift in the localization of consciousness, a sort of separation from the body, or from the cerebral cortex or cerebrum, which is conjectured to be the seat of conscious phenomena. If we are correct in this assumption, then we must ask ourselves whether there is some other nervous substrate in us, apart from the cerebrum, that can think and perceive, or whether the psychic processes that go on in us during loss of consciousness are synchronistic phenomena, i.e., events which have no causal connection with organic processes. This last possibility cannot be rejected out of hand in view of the existence of ESP, i.e., of perceptions independent of space and time, which cannot be explained as processes in the biological substrate. Where sense perceptions are impossible from the start, it can hardly be a question of anything but synchronicity. But where there are spatial and temporal conditions which would make perception and apperception possible in principle, and only the activity of consciousness or the cortical function is extinguished, and where, as in our example, a conscious phenomenon like perception and judgment nevertheless occurs, then the question of a nervous substrate might well be considered. It is well nigh axiomatic that conscious processes are tied to the cerebrum, and that the lower centers contain nothing but chains of reflexes which in themselves are unconscious. This is particularly true of the sympathetic system. Hence the insects, which have no cerebrospinal nervous system at all, but only a double chain of ganglia, are regarded as reflex automata. This view has recently been challenged by the researches which von Frisch of Graz made into the life of bees. It turns out that bees not only tell their comrades, by means of a peculiar sort of dance, that they have found a feeding place, but that they also indicate its direction and distance, thus enabling the beginners to fly to it directly. This kind of message is no different in principle from information conveyed by a human being. In the latter case, we would certainly regard such behavior as a conscious and intentional act, and can hardly imagine how anyone could prove in a court of law that it had taken place unconsciously. We could, at a pinch, admit on the basis of psychiatric experiences that objective information can in exceptional cases be communicated in a twilight state, but would expressly deny that communications of this kind are normally unconscious. Nevertheless, it would be possible to suppose that in bees, the process is unconscious. But that would not help to solve the problem, because we are still faced with the fact that the ganglionic system apparently achieves exactly the same result as our cerebral cortex. Nor is there any proof that bees are unconscious. Thus, we are driven to the conclusion that a nervous substrate, like the sympathetic system, which is absolutely different from the cerebrospinal system in point of origin and function, can evidently produce thoughts and perceptions just as easily as the latter. What then are we to think of the sympathetic system in vertebrates? Can it also produce or transmit specifically psychic processes? Von Frisch's observations prove the existence of transcerebral thought and perception. One must bear this possibility in mind if we want to account for the existence of some form of consciousness during an unconscious coma. During a coma, the sympathetic system is not paralyzed and could therefore be considered as a possible carrier of psychic functions. If that is so, then one must ask whether the normal state of unconsciousness in sleep and the potentially conscious dreams it contains can be regarded in the same light. Whether, in other words, dreams are produced not so much by the activity of the sleeping cortex as by the unsleeping sympathetic system, and are therefore of a transcerebral nature. Outside the realm of psychophysical parallelism, which we cannot at present pretend to understand, synchronicity is not a phenomenon whose regularity it is at all easy to demonstrate. One is as much impressed by the disharmony of things as one is surprised by their occasional harmony. In contrast to the idea of a pre-established harmony, the synchronistic factor merely stipulates the existence of an intellectually necessary principle which could be added as a fourth to the recognized triad of space, time, and causality. These factors are necessary but not absolute. Most psychic contents are non-spatial. Time and causality are psychically relative. And in the same way, the synchronistic factor proves to be only conditionally valid. But unlike causality, which reigns despotically over the whole picture of the macrophysical world, and whose universal rule is shattered only in certain lower orders of magnitude, synchronicity is a phenomenon that seems to be primarily connected with psychic conditions, that is to say, with processes in the unconscious. Synchronistic phenomena are found to occur experimentally with some degree of regularity and frequency in the intuitive, magical procedures where they are subjectively convincing but are extremely difficult to verify objectively and cannot be statistically evaluated, at least at present. On the organic level, it might be possible to regard biological morphogenesis in the light of the synchronistic factor. Professor A.M. Dalk of Brussels understands form, despite its tie with matter, as a continuity that is supraordinate to the living organism. Sir James Jeans reckons radioactive decay among the causeless events which, as we have seen, include synchronicity. He says, radioactive breakup appeared to be an effect without a cause, and suggested that the ultimate laws of nature were not even causal. This highly paradoxical formula, coming from the pen of a physicist, is typical of the intellectual dilemma with which radioactive decay confronts us. It, or rather the phenomenon of half-life, appears as an instance of a causal orderedness, a conception which also includes synchronicity, and to which I shall revert below. Synchronicity is not a philosophical view, but an empirical concept which postulates an intellectually necessary principle. This cannot be called either materialism or metaphysics. No serious investigator would assert that the nature of what is observed to exist, and of that which observes, namely the psyche, are known and recognized quantities. If the latest conclusions of science are coming nearer and nearer to a unitary idea of being, characterized by space and time on the one hand, and by causality and synchronicity on the other, that has nothing to do with materialism. Rather, it seems to show that there is some possibility of getting rid of the incommensurability between the observed and the observer. The result, in that case, would be a unity of being which would have to be expressed in terms of a new conceptual language, a neutral language, as W. Pauli once called it. Space, time, and causality, the triad of classical physics, would then be supplemented by the synchronicity factor and become a tetrad, a quaternio, which makes possible a whole judgment: space at the top, time at the bottom, causality on the left, synchronicity on the right. Here, synchronicity is to the three other principles as the one-dimensionality of time is to the three-dimensionality of space, or as the recalcitrant fourth in the Timaeus, which, Plato says, can only be added by force to the other three. Just as the introduction of time as the fourth dimension in modern physics postulates an irrepresentable space-time continuum, so the idea of synchronicity with its inherent quality of meaning produces a picture of the world so irrepresentable as to be completely baffling. The advantage, however, of adding this concept is that it makes possible a view which includes the psychoid factor in our description and knowledge of nature, that is, an a priori meaning or equivalence. The problem that runs like a red thread through the speculations of alchemists for 1500 years thus repeats and solves itself, the so-called axiom of Maria the Jewess, or Copt. Out of the third comes the one as the fourth. This cryptic observation confirms what I said above, that in principle, new points of view are not, as a rule, discovered in territory that is already known, but in out-of-the-way places that may even be avoided because of their bad name. The old dream of the alchemists, the transmutation of chemical elements, this much derided idea, has become a reality in our own day, and its symbolism, which was no less an object of ridicule, has turned out to be a veritable gold mine for the psychology of the unconscious. Their dilemma of 3 and 4, which began with the story that serves as a setting for the Timaeus and extends all the way to the Kabiri scene in Faust Part 2, is recognized by a 16th century alchemist, Gerhard Dorn, as the decision between the Christian Trinity and the serpens quadricornutus, the four-horned serpent who is the devil. As though in anticipation of things to come, he anathematizes the pagan quaternity, which was ordinarily so beloved of the alchemists, on the ground that it arose from the binarius, the number 2, and is thus something material, feminine, and devilish. Dr. von Franz has demonstrated this emergence of Trinitarian thinking in the parable of Bernard of Treviso, in Kunrath's Amphitheatrum, in Michael Meyer, and in the anonymous author of the Aquarium Sapientum. W. Pauli calls attention to the polemical writings of Kepler and of Robert Fludd, in which Fludd's correspondence theory was the loser and had to make room for Kepler's theory of 3 principles. The decision in favor of the triad, which in certain respects ran counter to the alchemical tradition, was followed by a scientific epoch that knew nothing of correspondence and clung with passionate insistence to a triadic view of the world, a continuation of the Trinitarian type of thinking, which described and explained everything in terms of space, time, and causality. The revolution brought about by the discovery of radioactivity has considerably modified the classical views of physics. So great is the change of standpoint that we have to revise the classical schema I made use of above, as I was able, thanks to the friendly interest which Professor Pauli evinced in my work, to discuss these questions of principle with a professional physicist who could at the same time appreciate my psychological arguments. I am in a position to put forward a suggestion that takes modern physics into account. Pauli suggested replacing the opposition of space and time in the classical schema by conservation of energy and the space-time continuum. This suggestion led me to a closer definition of the other pair of opposites, causality and synchronicity, with a view to establishing some kind of connection between these two heterogeneous concepts. We finally agreed on the following quaternio: indestructible energy at the top, space-time continuum at the bottom, constant connection through effect, causality. At the left, inconstant connection through contingence, equivalence, or meaning, synchronicity, at the right. This schema satisfies on the one hand the postulates of modern physics, and on the other hand, those of psychology. The psychological point of view needs clarifying. A causalistic explanation of synchronicity seems out of the question for the reasons given above. It consists essentially of chance equivalences. Their tertium comparationis rests on the psychoid factors I call archetypes. These are indefinite. That is to say, they can be known and determined only approximately. Although associated with causal processes, or carried by them, they continually go beyond their frame of reference, an infringement to which I would give the name transgressivity, because the archetypes are not found exclusively in the psychic sphere, but can occur just as much in circumstances that are not psychic, equivalence of an outward physical process with a psychic one. Archetypal equivalences are contingent to causal determination. That is to say, there exist between them and the causal processes no relations that conform to law. They seem, therefore, to represent a special instance of randomness or chance, or of that random state which runs through time in a way that fully conforms to law, as Andreas Speiser says. It is an initial state which is not governed by mechanistic law, but is the precondition of law, the chance substrate on which law is based. If we consider synchronicity or the archetypes as the contingent, then the latter takes on the specific aspect of a modality that has the functional significance of a world-constituting factor. The archetype represents psychic probability, portraying ordinary instinctual events in the form of types. It is a special psychic instance of probability in general, which is made up of the laws of chance and lays down rules for nature just as the laws of mechanics do. We must agree with Speiser that although in the realm of pure intellect, the contingent is a formless substance, it reveals itself to psychic introspection, so far as inward perception can grasp it at all, as an image, or rather a type, which underlies not only the psychic equivalences, but, remarkably enough, the psychophysical equivalences too. It is difficult to divest conceptual language of its causalistic coloring. Thus, the word underlying, despite its causalistic connotation, does not refer to anything causal, but simply to an existing quality, an irreducible contingency which is just so. The meaningful coincidence or equivalence of a psychic and a physical state that have no causal relationship to one another means, in general terms, that it is a modality without a cause and a causal orderedness. Into this category come all acts of creation, a priori factors such as the properties of natural numbers, the discontinuities of modern physics, etc. Consequently, we would have to include constant and experimentally reproducible phenomena within the scope of our expanded concept, though this does not seem to accord with the nature of the phenomena included in synchronicity, narrowly understood. The latter are mostly individual cases which cannot be repeated experimentally. This is not, of course, altogether true, as Rhine's experiments show and numerous other experiences with clairvoyant individuals. These facts prove that even in individual cases which have no common denominator and rank as curiosities, there are certain regularities and therefore constant factors from which we must conclude that our narrower conception of synchronicity is probably too narrow and really needs expanding. I incline, in fact, to the view that synchronicity in the narrow sense is only a particular instance of general acausal orderedness, that namely, of the equivalence of psychic and physical processes where the observer is in the fortunate position of being able to recognize the tertium comparationis. But as soon as he perceives the archetypal background, he is tempted to trace the mutual assimilation of independent psychic and physical processes back to a causal effect of the archetype, and thus to overlook the fact that they are merely contingent. This danger is avoided if one regards synchronicity as a special instance of general acausal orderedness. In this way, we also avoid multiplying our principles of explanation illegitimately. For the archetype is the introspectively recognizable form of a priori psychic orderedness. If an external synchronistic process now associates itself with it, it falls into the same basic pattern. In other words, it too is ordered. This form of orderedness differs from that of the properties of natural numbers or the discontinuities of physics in that the latter have existed from eternity and occur regularly, whereas the forms of psychic orderedness are acts of creation in time. That, incidentally, is precisely why I have stressed the element of time as being characteristic of these phenomena and called them synchronistic. The modern discovery of discontinuity, e.g. the orderedness of energy quanta, of radium decay, etc., has put an end to the sovereign rule of causality and thus to the triad of principles. The territory lost by the latter belonged earlier to the sphere of correspondence and sympathy, concepts which reached their greatest development in Leibniz's idea of pre-established harmony. Schopenhauer knew far too little about the empirical foundations of correspondence to realize how hopeless his causalistic attempt at explanation was. Today, thanks to the ESP experiments, we have a great deal of empirical material at our disposal. We can form some conception of its reliability when we learn from G.E. Hutchinson that the ESP experiments conducted by S.G. Soule and K.M. Goldney have a probability of 1 in 10, this being equivalent to the number of molecules in 250,000 tons of water. There are relatively few experiments in the field of the natural sciences whose results come anywhere near so high a degree of certainty. The exaggerated skepticism in regard to ESP is really without a shred of justification. The main reason for it is simply the ignorance which nowadays, unfortunately, seems to be the inevitable accompaniment of specialism and screens off the necessarily limited horizon of specialist studies from all higher and wider points of view in the most undesirable way. How often have we not found that the so-called superstitions contain a core of truth that is well worth knowing? It may well be that the originally magical significance of the word wish, which is still preserved in wishing rod, divining rod, or magic wand, and expresses not just wishing in the sense of desire, but a magical action, and the traditional belief in the efficacy of prayer, are both based on the experience of concomitant synchronistic phenomena. Synchronicity is no more baffling or mysterious than the discontinuities of physics. It is only the ingrained belief in the sovereign power of causality that creates intellectual difficulties and makes it appear unthinkable that causeless events exist or could ever occur. But if they do, then we must regard them as creative acts, as the continuous creation of a pattern that exists from all eternity, repeats itself sporadically, and is not derivable from any known antecedents. We must, of course, guard against thinking of every event whose cause is unknown as causeless. This, as I have already stressed, is admissible only when a cause is not even thinkable. But thinkability is itself an idea that needs the most rigorous criticism. Had the atom corresponded to the original philosophical conception of it, its fissionability would be unthinkable. But once it proves to be a measurable quantity, its non-fissionability becomes unthinkable. Meaningful coincidences are thinkable as pure chance. But the more they multiply, and the greater and more exact the correspondence is, the more their probability sinks and their unthinkability increases, until they can no longer be regarded as pure chance, but, for lack of a causal explanation, have to be thought of as meaningful arrangements. As I have already said, however, their inexplicability is not due to the fact that the cause is unknown, but to the fact that a cause is not even thinkable in intellectual terms. This is necessarily the case when space and time lose their meaning or have become relative, for under those circumstances, a causality which presupposes space and time for its continuance can no longer be said to exist and becomes altogether unthinkable. For these reasons, it seems to me necessary to introduce, alongside space, time, and causality, a category which not only enables us to understand synchronistic phenomena as a special class of natural events, but also takes the contingent partly as a universal factor existing from all eternity, and partly as the sum of countless individual acts of creation occurring in time.